One of the reasons why I supported NATO was because it gave us basing rights. It allowed us to have bases in Europe that we could use in a contingency, like something in the Middle East. And so when you have NATO partners denying you the use of those bases, when the primary reason why NATO is good for America is now being denied to us by Spain, as an example, then what's the purpose of the alliance? It starts becoming their allies when they want to be kind of.
Tiger.
And look, to be fair, there are countries in NATO that were very helpful to us. So I do think there's some very legitimate questions to ask about NATO, and that is, what is the purpose of being an alliance whose benefit to us? This is a very legitimate question that we need to address.
What should our relationship be with NATO going forward? Check out this great clip over here with Secretary of State Marco Rubio on his take on these things. We'll watch it together, then talk about it. But first, hit subscribe in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch.
You had an opportunity recently to meet with Pope Leo from Chicago, an American. The only thing that surprised me about his conflict, and I went to Catholic schools for 12 years. I studied Latin, I studied theology, etc. And when he said, God doesn't support any conflict. I'm like, the God of the Old Testament, same as the God in the New Testament. I could start with, David and Goliath. I'm not sure if I agreed with that, and I got killed, in the media. How dare I challenge the Pope? But how did the meeting go? Take us inside.
It was a positive meeting. Look, I think I always start with the premise that the papacy and the Pope is not a political office. It's covered by political reporters as a political office, but it's not. It is it's the vicar of Christ. For those of us who are Roman Catholic, it's the belief that he is the successor of Peter and on earth. And so now, in that realm, you're going to make statements about social policy and even global policies that are going to touch on politics. And consistently, the church has said that they want to promote peace, that they prefer to avoid wars. They don't like wars. And that's been a position for a long time. Obviously, our perspective is different in that regard. I agree. We wouldn't want wars either. We're not, I don't think we're in favor of war, but for a nation state, which is different from a religious office, for a nation state, there are threats to your security and to the well-being of your people that have to be addressed. Ideally through a diplomatic means, but there are conflicts and there are issues in the world that cannot be solved diplomatically, no matter how hard you try. There's been over a decade of work done to try to diplomatically solve Iran's desire and ambition to have a nuclear weapons program. We haven't gotten any result. What was the diplomatic solution for an Adolf Hitler, as an example? There was none, right? And unfortunately led to a war. So that's where I think the realm of the geopolitical is different, and has to. We are obviously guided by our faith, and we're instructed by our faith. That's the compass by which we live our lives. We also have an obligation to the national security of our country, and that has to be taken into account. That's our primary job, is to keep Americans safe. And that's why we're involved in Iran. That's why we're involved in anything we do around the world.
What about the Pope? Was he receptive to your comments and what you were saying?
I found him very, it's very unique because traditionally you're meeting with a Pope and, he's going to have an accent or he's going to have an interpreter. This is an American Pope. I mean, we spoke for over an hour. We talked about a lot of topics, by the way.
Like Chicago baseball. I think he likes the White Sox.
But he does. And, but this is a Pope, by the way, that understands the United States very well. Obviously, he follows our news very carefully. He's quite aware of current events in our country. But also, we had a lot of other things to talk about. He's concerned about religious freedom. He just came back from Africa, where the church is growing very fast, but ISIS and other terrorist elements are threatening Christians in Africa. I think he's concerned about events in Latin America. He had just had a visit from the bishops of Venezuela. So he wanted to inquire as to how I thought that was going. We've actually worked with the church in Cuba. We after the hurricane, we distributed, or have tried to distribute, over $6 million of humanitarian aid via the Catholic Church. We've offered to do more. We've offered to distribute $100 million of humanitarian aid to the Cuban people through the church, and the regime has denied it, the Cuban regime. So there was a lot we covered.
And they're starving. I don't know. I think just to be Secretary of State, that's a pretty cool jacket they gave you.
Yeah, it was a gift that somebody gave me, and it's good to wear it on the plane.
Look, you were a senator for all these years. I've known you for so many years. We've had a friendship for so many years. How do you compare this job to everything else you've done?
Well, it's quite different, right? The work of a legislator involves constituent service, and it involves writing of legislation, committee meetings, oversight, and I enjoyed doing all of that. and it was an important era in our life. This was a very different opportunity. This isn't the executive branch. Here, you're actually executing on laws, and you're basically executing the president's foreign policy. So I enjoy the role, I enjoy the job, and I enjoy working for this president because he's willing to do what others talk about but don't do. You know, when you say, well, we can't do that, and you'll say, why? That's his question. Why? Why can't we do that? Why hasn't this been done before? He is willing to do what others are not willing to do. He is willing to solve unfinished business and not leave it for the next guy or gal. And I admire that, and it's a lot of fun to be a part of it.
You know what's frustrated me is there are some that interpret the Trump doctrine, as I call it, as isolationism. Well, he took out the ISIS caliphate, took out Soleimani, Baghdadi, dropped the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan, Midnight Hammer, and he will wrap up Epic Fury. And he did make the raid on Maduro. But I see three lessons he's learned in history. And this is the last question. And I see that he saw that over 100 million souls died in the last century. So if you can take out or neutralize a threat ahead of time, it's smart. I also think he learned from Reagan peace through strength. He built up the military in his first term. And I love the idea that he doesn't want to be an occupational force and doesn't want forever wars. Yeah. I
do, and I would just add one more element to it. America's going to be engaged in the world. This is not about turning inward, but we are going to engage in the world based on what's good for America. What's in the national interest of the United States? Does what we're doing make the country safer, more secure, more prosperous? If it does, it's in our national interest. If it doesn't, it might be a nice thing to do, but it won't be as high up on the priority list. So that's where I think you see him engaging in the world. He doesn't engage in every conflict and in every topic. I mean, we have an opinion. We may try to do something in the margins, but he gets engaged and spends his time focused on things around the world that directly impact the security and the prosperity of the American people. If there's some place in the world where Americans' business can prosper and therefore help our economy, the president's engaged. If it's trade to benefit our factories, our workers, the president's engaged. If it's a threat to our national security, whether it's now or something that looms 3 years down the road, the president's not going to leave it as unfinished business. He engages.
I'm worried about NATO. I felt that they didn't have the moral clarity on the #1 state sponsor of terror. That's troubling to me.
Yeah, the problem with NATO, and I've been a supporter of NATO throughout my career in the Senate. And one of the reasons why I supported NATO was because it gave us basing rights. It allowed us to have bases in Europe that we could use in a contingency, like something in the Middle East, you know, where you could have planes flying from some country in Europe and actually protecting our national interests in the Middle East, as an example, or in Africa. And so when you have NATO partners denying you the use of those bases, when the primary reason why NATO is good for America is now being denied to us by Spain, as an example, then what's the purpose of the alliance? It starts becoming they're allies when they want to be, kind of. And look, to be fair, there are countries in NATO that were very helpful to us. I just singling one out, Portugal. They said yes before we even told them what the question was. Poland. So there are countries that Romania, Bulgaria, others like Spain have been atrocious, just horrifying. So I do think there's some very legitimate questions to ask about NATO, and that is, what is the purpose of being an alliance whose benefit to us is these basing rights, if in a time of conflict, like the one we've had with Iran, they can deny us the use of those bases? So why are we there for? Only to protect them, but not to further our national interests? This is a very legitimate question.
What actually holds nations together? What makes alliances survive? Is it fear, money, military contracts, geography, or something deeper? Because Rubio makes a fascinating point. He says something that some countries are technically allies on paper, but when critical moments come, moments of real danger, some hesitate. Some disappear. Some suddenly redefine what ally means. And then he contrasts that with countries that actually show up, countries willing to sacrifice, countries willing to take risks. And interestingly enough, he points to Israel. Now, whether you agree with every political policy or not, I think Rubio accidentally touches on something profoundly biblical here, because the prophets spoke about this exact dynamic thousands of years ago. And it wasn't not NATO, not modern geopolitics, but the spiritual law behind nations. And here's the principle. An alliance without shared values eventually collapses. Think about that. An alliance without shared values eventually collapses. You can build partnerships on economics. You could build partnerships on military convenience. You can build partnerships on fear of a common enemy. But if there's no shared moral center, eventually the cracks begin. Because pressure reveals what people truly believe, and pressure reveals what nations truly believe. There's an old saying, hard times do not build character, they reveal character. The same is true for civilizations, and this is exactly what Rubio was talking about. Who actually stands with you when things get dangerous? Who carries the burden? Who sacrifices? Who merely benefits? Now, from a Torah perspective, this matters enormously, because the Jewish view of power has never been might makes right. Never. The Torah says power without morality becomes corruption. Strength without purpose becomes destruction. As the saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But Judaism adds something deeper. Prayer without power, and prayer without your higher power, God, eventually destroys itself. And this is where prophecy becomes fascinating. The prophet Isaiah speaks about nations in moral confusion, about civilizations losing clarity, about good becoming blurred. The prophet says, Book of Isaiah, woe unto those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Think about that verse for a second. What happens to a civilization when it can no longer tell the difference between right and wrong? Between courage and cowardice, between justice and appeasement, between ally and opportunist. This is not merely a political crisis. This is a spiritual crisis. And I think Rubio is pointing to something many people feel right now. The world is changing. The old order is shaking. People sense instability. Alliances are being questioned. Nations are being recalculated. And why? Because fear reveals priorities. Pressure reveals truth. And then Rubio says something very important about Israel. He points out that unlike many allies who fail to meet commitments, Israel invests. Israel innovates. Israel contributes intelligence, defense, technology. And again, this is bigger than politics, because for thousands of years, the Jewish people have understood something. You pray for peace, but prepare for reality. That's what Jacob did. King David wrote, seek peace and pursue it. Bakei shalom urodfeu. But the Torah never teaches to be naive. Peace is the goal. But peace without strength invites chaos. Diplomacy matters, but diplomacy without moral clarity can become denial. And Rubio gives the example of diplomacy failing with evil regimes. Now, that may sound uncomfortable to some people, but history forces us to ask hard questions. What happens when evil cannot be negotiated with? History already gave us painful answers. Sometimes civilizations mistake delay for wisdom, appeasement for peace, weakness for morality, and the cost becomes devastating. There's another prophetic idea here that I think matters deeply. The prophet Jeremiah speaks about nations stumbling because they lose moral direction. And Ezekiel speaks repeatedly about nations rising and falling, not merely because of military strength, but because of spiritual condition. That's a radical idea in modern politics. We think economics determine history. Weapons determine history. Strategy determines history. But the prophets say something shocking. Moral clarity determines destiny. Read history carefully. Empires don't only collapse from enemies on the outside. They collapse when confusion enters inside, when conviction disappears, when people stop believing in anything larger than comfort. And this brings us back to this conversation, to Rubio's final point. Shared values. Because maybe that is the real story here. Not NATO, not defense spending, not even geopolitics. The deeper question is, what values actually hold civilizations together? Courage, truth, sacrifice, faith, responsibility, moral clarity. Because without these, even the strongest systems eventually collapse. And here is where Israel becomes important. Not because Israel is perfect. No nation is perfect. But because Israel represents an idea that history has a purpose, that morality matters, that God matters, that civilization cannot survive on material success alone. The prophet Ezekiel speaks about a future where nations will eventually recognize something larger than power itself. That history is moving somewhere towards accountability, towards truth, towards redemption. And despite all the chaos we see in the world right now, I actually believe that something hopeful. The world is not falling apart. It is being clarified. Good and evil are becoming more visible. Truth and confusion are separating. And in times like this, people are forced to choose what they stand for. Because eventually, every nation, every person must answer one question. What do you actually serve? Power? Comfort? Fear? Or truth? And maybe that's the deeper conversation hidden underneath this Rubio interview. Not politics, but prophecy. Not alliances, but values. Because in the end, the future belongs to civilizations that remember something eternal. Strength matters, but moral strength matters more. And according to the prophets, the world does ultimately move towards a good place, but only when humanity relearns its relationship with God. And the moral responsibility that comes with freedom is important for that. What do you think? Is the world dividing politically or spiritually? Let me know below. Thank you for watching. From just outside Jerusalem, Shalom.